Iris. My name is Iris. I drove an ambulance during the war. I was a good driver. When I trained for the job, well, you couldn't call it training exactly. We had to drive at speed around obstacles on a disused pig field. That was about the extent of it. But I was full of excitement and nerves, and desperately wanting to do my bit for the war effort. Mother wasn't at all pleased, and threatened to disinherit me. Father, although terribly worried, knew I was his daughter through and through, and so would always do exactly as I pleased. Mother had plans for me that I was selfishly mucking up, as the poor darling so eloquently put it. But I was not to be swayed, so off I went, full of nervous anticipation and holding fast to Father's sage advice to fuck up the Jerrys at every opportunity. I didn't know what opportunities would arise as an ambulance driver in which to apply his advice. He'd never forgiven them for blowing his leg off the first time around, so this may have coloured his thinking a little. My excitement at being an ambulance driver was short-lived when I began with my colleagues to pick up the badly injured young men. I hadn't seen many deaths before the war. My darling grandmama had died when I was little, and I once found our old gamekeeper half in and half out of a pheasant pen. He had keeled over with a heart attack and was a rather fetching shade of blue. I don't know who was more surprised, me or the disgruntled pheasants still waiting to be fed. And my pets, of course. I had buried several of them over the years, and was dreadfully upset each time. Although Georgie, my favourite pug, in his old age had used the sitting room carpet as a toilet so many times that it never did seem to dry out. When he died, Mother said, "Sod the war effort, we are having a new carpet. If I smell piss again, it will be too soon." My career choice was certainly a baptism of fire, and I will never forget picking up my first injured soldier. The poor darling had terrible injuries, including the loss of both legs below the knee. Such a fine-looking boy, too, and he was so good when he was in such terrible pain. He held on to my hand as we put him in the ambulance. Held on for grim death he did, and begged me not to leave him. He told me his mother was called Marjorie, and to please tell her he had died a hero's death. Even in the face of his own death, he wanted to make his dear mother proud. I held his gaze and kept telling him that I would find his mother and tell her what a fine son she had. Then a curious thing happened. I've never forgotten it. He smiled. He looked over my shoulder and smiled at someone only he could see, and said just one word, "Pops." Just one word, "Pops." And that was it. Then the light faded in his eyes, and he slipped away from us, away from fear and pain and noise, to somewhere I hoped was far nicer for him. I was shaken to the core, but there was no time to dwell on anything or anyone. I dealt with so much death in so many forms that I gradually became numb to it. Not numb enough not to be compassionate, you understand, but if I'd let all the emotions on board, I would have been a gibbering wreck and no use to man nor beast. But I never forgot that young man. Some time later, I tracked down and visited his mother Marjorie. She was a nice woman, although I could see that the death of her boy had aged her, and a deep sadness hung about her like a cloak. Marjorie lived in an old rectory. She had asked me in, and over tea I told her of her son's last moments on earth. She was deeply touched to hear he had spoken of her. I told her he had died a hero's death. This was not a lie, because in my eyes, every soldier who walked into a war, willingly or not, should be commended for doing so. Marjorie placed a hand over mine and began to cry. After a minute or two, she composed herself and told me that her darling son, her only child, made her proud just by being the sort of boy he was, and then she cried again. Her pain was palpable, and in an effort to ease this somewhat, I found myself mentioning his smile when he died, and him saying the word Pops. She looked at me in wonder, and broke into a smile that so reminded me of her boy. She told me that Pops was her father, Dick's grandfather, and she had been praying to him daily to look after her boy and to see him safely to heaven if the war claimed him. Mrs. Wallace told me through her tears that she could rest now, knowing that they were together. I left the house profoundly moved by the whole experience. I had never really had a belief in the hereafter. Much as Mother and the local vicar, whom my father believed to be on commission, such was his zeal, tried to rope me into church, I didn't have a religious belief of any kind. But this encounter with Private Wallace and his poor mother had changed something in me, and I can remember thinking to myself that I hoped someone I loved would come for me when I died. A year and many adventures later, I was visiting a friend's parents in the East End and rushing across the road to an air raid shelter when I saw my beloved grandmamma across the street waving to me. I waved back, and in that split second I remembered that she had died years before. As this thought registered, the entire street had a direct hit from a bomb or something equally dreadful. I remember nothing except my lovely, lovely grandmamma hugging me. I knew I was not in a physical body anymore. I was shocked, angry, sad, and happy all at the same time. I looked back at the devastation around me. The houses that were there before were now huge piles of rubble. People were screaming, and fires had started from ruptured gas pipes. It looked like a vision of hell. I was full of questions. My grandmamma looked solid to me. She felt solid. I was not hallucinating. I was dead. Dead, and I could see my lovely grandmamma. I didn't know what to do with myself. This was so unexpected, yet so comforting. My lovely grandmamma said, "Come along, darling, there's nothing for you to do here," took my hand and led me away. Everywhere I looked, people were meeting people. Real, solid-looking people. People they loved and hadn't seen for a long, long time. It was so wonderful, so calming. And then I saw my own darling Georgie running toward me, his stumpy tail wagging so hard his entire back end had a life of its own. I scooped up my little dog and squeezed him to me. He was as deliriously happy to see me as I was to see him. So my message to you, my reason for coming through, is to tell anyone who would listen. Whether they believe or not, don't worry when your time comes. Whatever situation you are in at the time, wherever you are in the world, whether you are religious or not, don't worry, because someone you truly love and who truly loves you will have been watching over you and will come for you. You will see them, I promise. Oh yes, and the much-loved pets you had, you will see them too. They will be waiting for you. Love. That's all that matters. Just love. Thank you so much for listening to me. I do hope I have helped you in some small way. Cheerio, darlings. Cheerio.